I'm Jim Williams of the Energy and Resources Group and Program Director for the Forum, and I'm here to introduce the last panel of the day. We won't take the advertised break, but we'll go ahead and start with the panel on what must be done, emission limits, ethics, and the right to development. Our first speaker is Professor John Holdren, who is the Teresa and John Hines Professor of Environmental Policy and Director of the Program on Science, Technology, and Public Policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, where he's also Professor of Environmental Science and Policy in Harvard's Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. He's the Director of the Woods Hole Research Center. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and as of this year, he is the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. John has labored these many years on global environmental change, its causes and consequences, on the analysis of energy technologies and policies, and on reducing the dangers from nuclear weapons and materials. And it is in this latter regard that in 1995, he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs, which he served as chair from 1987 to 1997. John.
Okay, I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground leading into a panel which has a big assignment by talking about targets, options, and strategies for climate change mitigation in the context of the title of our session, which is What Must Be Done, Emission Limits, Ethics, and the Right to Development. And after I talk, I will introduce the other panelists, we'll run through the presentations, and then, as usual, open it up to discussion in the wider group. Facing, as we are, a growing set of climate change dangers that we've heard a good deal about earlier in the day, we as a society basically have three options. The first one is mitigation, meaning, of course, measures to reduce the pace and the magnitude of the changes in global climate that are being caused by human activities. That refers to things like reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, enhancing the sinks that take up those gases, geoengineering to counteract the warming effects of greenhouse gases, and the like. Second choice is adaptation, which refers to measures that we could take to reduce the adverse impacts on human well-being resulting from the changes in climate that do occur. Things like changing agricultural practices, strengthening defenses against climate-related disease, building more dams and dikes, and so on. I should mention there are a lot of words on some of these slides. I put them there so that after this thing is posted, particularly our Chinese colleagues will be able to figure out what I said too rapidly when I gave the talk. Third choice, of course, is suffering the adverse impacts that are not avoided by either mitigation or adaptation. I would argue that mitigation and adaptation are both essential. Human-caused climate change is already occurring. We're already adapting to it. Efforts to do that are already taking place. We're going to need to expand them. But a point that is crucial to understand is that adaptation becomes both costlier and less effective as the magnitude of climate change grows. The greater the amount of mitigation we can achieve at affordable cost, the smaller the burdens that are placed on adaptation, and the smaller the suffering is going to be. And so I'm going to focus here in the context of our emissions limits session topic on mitigation, more specifically the size of the need for mitigation, the available approaches for it, and the strategies that we would need to succeed at it. First of all, let me start with where we're headed without it. We've seen a bit of this morning. I'll give you my business as usual scenario out to 2100, population ending up at about 10 billion, economy growing at 2.4% in real terms throughout the century, more than 10 tuples, energy because energy intensity is declining at the long-term historical rate of about 1% per year, does not grow as fast as GDP, but it still grows fourfold in the 21st century. And fossil carbon emitted as carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion goes from about 6.4 billion tons in 2000 to over 20 billion tons in 2100. This, as I mentioned, corresponds to sort of middle-of-the-road assumptions about economic growth, about the rate of decline in energy intensity, and the smaller rate of decline in the carbon intensity of energy supply. In its overall greenhouse gas emissions impacts, it closely resembles the somewhat more complicated scenario IS-92A produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the early 90s. If you look at where that's taking us, again, a bit of a recap, reminding you, first of all, that global average surface temperature, the index that is used for so many of these discussions, is really just a proxy for the state of the climate. I actually think global warming is a misnomer. It makes people think of a gradual, somewhat pleasant process. What we're really talking about is a change in the state of the climate, where small changes in that index, the global average surface temperature, correspond to large changes in the patterns of hot and cold, wet and dry, snowpack and snowmelt, runoff, ocean currents, upwellings, winds, storm tracks, and so on, that really determine what happens and what can happen on this planet. And we are heading under the business as usual projection, not only far outside the range of variation of climate over the last 1,000 years, but ultimately outside the range experienced in the tenure of human beings on this planet. Turning to the opportunities and leverage for mitigation, how can we get off that trajectory? The options can be divided into a fairly small number of categories. First, change the quantity or the character of those human activities that are leading to emissions of greenhouse gases, particulate matter, or precursors of those. Secondly, you can try to alter the emissions of those substances from their natural sources. Thirdly, you can try to change the rates at which they're removed from the atmosphere. And finally, you can try to change other climate-relevant characteristics of the environment in order to offset the undesired influences on climate that would otherwise result from human activities. Looking at the potential leverage, what we need to look at is the magnitude of the human influences on climate, called in the trade forcings, measured in watts per square meter, averaged over the Earth's surface. You don't really need to know what that means technically. You can just consider it a measure of the relative push that these different human activities are exerting on the climate. Shown here in the two columns are firstly the forcing from 1750, the nominal beginning of the industrial age, up to the year 2000, and then the forcing extended out to 2100 under the middle-of-the-road scenario that I have described. In the last column, it simply indicates what the places are at which we could intervene to try to influence those numbers. You see that carbon dioxide is not the only actor. Methane, nitrous oxide, halocarbons, tropospheric ozone, black soot, all important warming influences. Reflective particles, both by virtue of reflecting sunlight, but also in their secondary effects, the cloud-forming effects of particles exerting cooling effects that have partly offset and indeed partly masked the warming effects of the greenhouse gases and black soot, some changes in surface reflectivity, and the grand totals. Just as an aside, people often wonder why scenarios of future climate change so often get described only in terms of carbon dioxide emissions and concentrations, even though all these other gases and particles also have significant effects. There are a couple of reasons. One is that the warming effects of increases over the last 250 years in the non-CO2 greenhouse gases and absorbing particles have, by coincidence, been approximately balanced by the middle-of-the-road estimate of the cooling effects of increases in reflecting particles. And that means it turns out, again by coincidence, that the net effect of all the human additions to the atmosphere over the last 250 years is about equal to the CO2 effect alone. Interestingly enough, that could remain approximately true in the future. It could be that growth or decline in the emissions that add to reflective particle concentrations could be matched by changes in the emissions of black soot and the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, so that the positive and negative forcings in those two categories continue to balance. If that's not the case, you can always express the greenhouse warming effects of the non-CO2 gases and the soot in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent for emissions and parts per million of CO2 equivalent for concentrations, and that's what you'll see throughout the literature. A few words on the implications of the pattern of influences in that table. First of all, the warming effects of increased concentrations of greenhouse gases and black soot are the dominant drivers of current global climate change. Among those, carbon dioxide is already the most important, and its relative importance compared to the other greenhouse gases and soot is expected under the middle-of-the-road business-as-usual type scenarios to grow significantly during the century we're now in. Carbon dioxide, as you could see from that previous table, accounted for 45% of the total positive forcing from 1750 out to 2000. Under the business-as-usual scenario, it would account for 60% out to 2100. Secondly, most of us know this already, fossil fuel combustion is the dominant source of the anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. The central estimates of those for the year 2000 are about 6.4 billion tons of carbon added to the atmosphere from the combustion of fossil fuels, 1.6 from deforestation, about 0.2 billion tons from cement production. Under the business-as-usual, middle-of-the-road scenario, the fossil and cement contributions increase about threefold by 2100. The deforestation contribution shrinks. In spite of this importance of carbon dioxide, and particularly carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, any gains that we can make in mitigation from approaches besides reducing fossil CO2 will, of course, be helpful and will reduce the pressure on the problem of reducing the CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, which, as we will see, is very challenging. Let's talk about those other approaches first, starting with reducing emissions of methane and soot. The anthropogenic methane comes from a variety of human activities: energy systems, livestock, agriculture, landfills, and waste treatment. There are technical means for reducing all of those, and there is the benefit that the relatively short atmospheric lifetime of methane compared to that of carbon dioxide means that emissions reductions translate relatively quickly into reduced concentrations and therefore reduced forcing. The black soot is coming from two-stroke and diesel engines, as well as from traditional uses of biomass fuels, agricultural burning, and forest fires. The engine and biomass fuels emissions are amenable to sharp reductions by technical means. Very short atmospheric lifetime of soot, days to weeks, means that emissions reductions translate very quickly into reduced forcing. Bottom line, gains here are worth seeking, but they might not be able to do much more than offset the reduced cooling from reductions in particle emissions, which are desirable from the public health and acid rain standpoint and probably will take place. Removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, the most obvious way to do this is increasing the storage of carbon in terrestrial plants and soils. Do that by afforestation, reforestation, improved management of agricultural soils. The third assessment of the IPCC, rather optimistically, I think, estimated the total potential for all of these combined to be 100 billion tons of carbon uptake by 2050. That would be about 20% of the business-as-usual emissions from now until then. Ocean fertilization to increase carbon uptake by phytoplankton, something that has now been tried using iron fertilization of oceanic regions where iron is the limiting nutrient, now looks questionable both in terms of efficacy and in terms of undesired side effects. Scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere technologically is possible, but it looks to be 5 to 10 times more costly than capturing the carbon dioxide at power plants before it's emitted. Geoengineering to counter the forcing from greenhouse gases. One approach to that would be increasing the surface reflectivity of the planet in order to cool it. We've done that inadvertently by deforestation and desertification over the course of the human tenure on this planet, but doing more of that is manifestly undesirable. You can increase the reflectivity of man-made surfaces, buildings and roads, That's a useful thing from the standpoint of the urban heat island effect, but global impact of it is limited by the small fraction of the land surface that's used for those purposes, about 2%. Large-scale alteration of the reflectivity of the oceans would be expected to have undesired effects both climatologically and ecologically, not a good idea. Increasing the atmosphere's reflectivity by injecting reflecting particles into the stratosphere has been argued to be both affordable and reversible in the sense that they don't stay there that long. So if you discover you're screwing it up, you can change course. Nonetheless, it does have potentially damaging effects in the realm of depleting stratospheric ozone. People have looked fairly closely at the idea of placing reflecting materials or mirrors in Earth orbit or at the Lagrangian equilibration point between the Sun and the Earth. There was an estimate at this year's meeting of the National Academy of Sciences that doing that would cost $2,400 trillion in order to offset the effects of about the next 20 years of greenhouse gas emissions. Probably not a good idea. Let us turn then to the options for reducing the fossil CO2 emissions. Those arise from a fourfold product: population times GDP per person times energy intensity of economic activity, energy over GDP times carbon intensity of energy supply. You've seen variants of this before. It's identically true. You can't argue about whether it's right. You might argue about whether it's useful. I suggest it is, because it enables us to apply knowledge of the separate disciplines that apply to these different variables to try to think systematically about what is happening. If we look at the leverage for reductions in these particular factors, population, lower, I think, is better for lots of reasons. 8 billion people in 2100 would be preferable by far to 10 billion. The good news there is that we already know that reduced growth can be achieved by measures attractive in their own right, particularly education, opportunity, health care, and reproductive rights for women. GDP per person is not a lever that most people would want to use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because with respect to this indicator, higher is generally accepted to be better. There are a few qualifications that one needs to enter. First of all, we're not getting rich as fast as we think if GDP growth comes at the expense of the environmental foundations of human well-being. Secondly, internalizing the environmental costs of economic growth, including the environmental costs of climate change, may slow that growth a bit, but probably not by much. I'll come back to that. And finally, some lifestyle changes in industrialized and other urban regions can be envisioned that would increase quality of life while reducing GDP. Quality of life and GDP are not exactly the same thing. Energy intensity of GDP, reducing it means getting more GDP out of less energy, increasing energy efficiency. That has been, as already mentioned, a long-term trend, about 1% per year on the global average over a period of quite a few decades. It obviously could be accelerated. That would entail more efficient cars, trucks, planes, buildings, appliances, manufacturing processes, as well as more efficient conversion of primary energy forms to electricity and portable fuels, as well as some economic restructuring to emphasize lower energy intensity economic activity. That opportunity clearly offers the largest, cheapest, fastest, soonest leverage on carbon emissions. Carbon intensity of energy supply, I see I left an L out there, a little typo. That ratio has also been falling historically, but considerably more slowly than energy intensity of GDP has been falling. If you want it to fall faster, you need to do some combination of changing the mix of fossil and non-fossil energy sources, most importantly, more renewables and or nuclear. And the other thing you can do is change the characteristics of the fossil fuel technologies themselves, most importantly, modifying them for carbon capture and sequestration of the carbon dioxide away from the atmosphere. How much mitigation do we need? How hard do we have to pull on the levers that we've got? The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, law of the land in 188 countries, although many people in this country don't know it. We did ratify it, but the people who did so have mainly forgotten, as best I can tell. Framework Convention calls, as probably everyone in this room knows, for stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference. This is coming to be an acronym, DAI. with the climate system. But of course, there was no formal consensus in 1992 as to what that meant, what constitutes dangerous anthropogenic interference, or what level of greenhouse gas concentrations would produce it. There's still no consensus on that point, no formal consensus, but I suggest it's increasingly clear that the current level of anthropogenic interference is dangerous. The global average surface temperature is now about 0.8 of a degree C above the pre-industrial value, and at that level, the world is already experiencing rising incidents of floods, droughts, wildfires, heat waves, coral bleaching, summer melting of sea ice and permafrost, shrinkage of mountain glaciers, accelerating loss of Greenland and Antarctic ice, drying out the rainforests, and an increased incidence of Category 4 and 5 cyclones. T average would rise another 0.6 of a degree centigrade even if the greenhouse gas concentrations could be stabilized instantaneously at today's level. That time lag is because of the thermal inertia of the oceans. Under continuation of business as usual in the growth of GDP and the use of fossil fuels, the increase in global average surface temperature above the pre-industrial value is likely to reach almost 2 degrees C by 2050, in the range of 3 degrees C by 2100, possibly much more for reasons adduced by John Hart this morning. And yet the best current science, and again John Hart referred extensively to most of this, in fact to more than this, suggests that increases in the average surface temperature above pre-industrial of 1.5 degrees could mean the end of coral reefs and the extinction of polar bears. Range of 2 degrees C could mean catastrophic and irreversible melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice, producing rates of sea level rise that might be much, much faster than those ordinarily cited. 2.5 degrees centigrade is likely to sharply reduce crop yields worldwide for reasons not entirely accounted for in the first few IPCC assessments, which couldn't really model pest and pathogen effects in a wetter, warmer world. Now, until a few years ago, a lot of analysts and groups were suggesting a target for stabilization that would avoid exceeding a temperature increase of around 3 degrees centigrade. That 3-degree target corresponding to a sum of human influences, meaning changes in all greenhouse gases plus absorbing and reflecting particles, that would be equivalent to a doubling of pre-industrial CO2 if that were the only thing happening, that is, an increase in the CO2 concentration to about 550 parts per million by volume. Equivalent to that, assuming, and I'll say more about this in a moment, a mid-range estimate of the sensitivity of the climate to greenhouse gas increases. That number, I think, was seen by most of the people advocating it as a compromise, perhaps the highest value that might be tolerable, taking into account the potential for adaptation and what we thought we knew at the time about the likely impacts, and at the same time the lowest value likely to be achievable, taking into account the known mitigation options and their estimated costs. Well, that has changed. The flood, if you'll forgive the term, of insights over the last few years of new science bearing on the rate at which impacts are emerging and growing has led a lot of analysts and groups over the last couple of years to argue for a tighter target, target around 2 degrees C. European Union has embraced a target of 2 degrees C. That would mean confining the sum of human influences to the equivalent of carbon dioxides reaching 400 to 450 parts per million by volume with a mid-range sensitivity. And of course, many people have expressed doubt whether such a tight target could in fact be achieved. I'll say a little more about that in a minute, but let me first, in a sort of a sidebar, note that relating temperature targets to equilibrium concentrations is a probabilistic matter. The climate sensitivity to greenhouse gas forcing, which is defined as the increase in average global surface temperature that corresponds to a doubling of pre-industrial CO2, is quite uncertain, mainly because of uncertainty about the size of the masking effect that reflecting particles have exerted in the warming observed up until now. The IPCC expresses the range of sensitivity values as 1.5 to 4.5 degrees C, best estimate around 3, but there is some evidence and analysis that suggests a significant probability that the true sensitivity could even be above 4.5. The higher the true sensitivity turns out to be, the lower the greenhouse gas concentration will need to be kept in order to avoid exceeding any specified temperature increase. Now, you can develop probability distributions for what the value of the sensitivity is and convert those into probabilities that a stabilized carbon dioxide concentration will lead to exceeding a specified delta T average. Here's an example from a paper by Schneider and Mastrandrea in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that plots the probability of exceeding various delta T's that have been associated by different groups with dangerous anthropogenic interference for stabilization at 500 parts per million and 600 parts per million CO2 equivalent. So the yellow curve is 500 parts per million, the red curve is 600 parts per million, and then all these values, DAI, are different estimates of where dangerous anthropogenic interference sets in. DAI EU is 1.4 degrees above 2000, which is about 2 degrees C above pre-industrial. And what you see is that at 600 parts per million, that has a 90% chance of being exceeded. At 500 parts per million, it has a 70% chance of being exceeded. This is not good news. Emission trajectories corresponding to stabilization at a given concentration of CO2 also have an uncertainty associated with them. That comes mainly from uncertainties in the carbon cycle models that are used to predict the movement of carbon among the atmosphere, vegetation, soils, and oceans. As Professor Hart noted this morning, those models currently don't incorporate all the feedbacks that might link rising temperature with carbon movement among those reservoirs. In principle, of course, feedbacks could help or hurt. They could be positive or negative. But based on current knowledge, hurt is more likely. John Hart talked about that this morning, Hart talking about hurt, meaning that stabilizing at a given carbon dioxide concentration will require lower emission trajectories than without those feedbacks. With those disclaimers, here's a standard picture of emissions trajectories consistent with various atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration ceilings. The green curve is the 550 part per million curve. The orange one on top is IS 92A, our middle-of-the-road business as usual. The gold line is the 450 part per million line, the one that corresponds roughly to 2 degrees C if sensitivity is in the middle of the range. Here's a picture that shows the dependence on climate sensitivity of the emissions trajectory that would correspond to stabilization not exceeding a temperature increase of 2 degrees C. The curve in the middle that is labeled 2 degrees C corresponds to a 2 degrees C sensitivity. The one at the top, 1.5 degrees minimum sensitivity. There you can get away with emitting a lot more, although ultimately you still have to come down steeply. The high sensitivity curve, 4.5 degrees C sensitivity, is one in which you see you have to plunge immediately from where we are today to much lower values in order to be on that stabilization trajectory. It says it could be very hard if sensitivity is high to stabilize at 450, rather to stabilize at a concentration that would not exceed a temperature rise of 2 degrees. A couple of points about this. The costs of delay in initiating reductions are likely to be substantial. Those costs will depend strongly on the choice of your goal and on the sensitivity of climate. The lower the stabilization target deemed prudent, the higher the costs of delay in starting to move toward it. Any further delay in starting puts the ability to stabilize below 450 parts per million in doubt, irrespective of cost. And for higher targets, moderate early action will cost far less than waiting until only drastic action can meet the target. For those who still consider the science supporting low targets to be unpersuasive, which I think is mainly people who don't know very much about it, you can consider early action an insurance policy against costly catastrophe. How difficult will it be? How much carbon-free energy would be needed to stabilize carbon dioxide at 550 parts per million, just to take the relatively easy case? You can do this calculation fairly easily under simplifying assumptions, showing how much carbon-free energy, renewables, nuclear, and advanced fossil technologies with carbon capture and sequestration, you would need to be on that 550 part per million stabilization trajectory as a function of how rapidly energy efficiency improves. If energy efficiency improves at the business as usual rate, 1% per year, you need 6 times as much carbon-free energy in 2050 as you had in 2000, and 15 times as much in 2100 as you had in 2000. If you can increase the rate of energy efficiency improvement over the whole world and the whole century to 50% greater than the historical rate, 1.5% per year, you still need as much carbon-free energy by 2050 as you were getting from fossil fuels in the year 2000, only if you can double the rate of efficiency improvement over the whole world and the whole century. Can you get down to the point where you only need as much carbon-free energy in 2100 as you were getting from fossil fuels in 2000? I'm going to skip, because I'm out of time, some complicated results looking at the case of stabilization to avoid exceeding delta T of 2 degrees C. You can look at this when this thing gets posted. Talk very quickly about policy options and strategy. There are a wide range of measures that one can consider for promoting mitigation, but any combination of those that does not include either emission cap and trade programs or taxes on carbon or energy is almost certain to be insufficient. We mostly know about this stuff. Policy options embraced to date: the Kyoto Protocol, the EU carbon trading system, what has been done in the non-federal jurisdictions in the United States. Federal energy policy has not amounted to much in the United States in recent years. Federal climate policy consists of R&D, incentives for private sector R&D, and accelerated deployment, and some modest voluntary targets. But there are a lot of state climate action plans, and the U.S. Senate last summer endorsed for the first time a national mandatory approach to greenhouse gas emission limitation, but it's not yet law. My own policy recommendations: we ought to be pursuing win-win technical and policy measures, measures that address economic, social, and non-climate goals as well as climate. We ought to be increasing investments in energy technology innovation, expanding international cooperation, and pursuing a new global framework for mitigation and adaptation in the post-Kyoto period. It's going to have to be mandatory economy-wide reductions essentially everywhere, reductions below business as usual, not below current levels, certainly in the developing countries. Needs to be equitable, achievable, and adequate to the magnitude of the challenge. We've already talked about what adequate is likely to entail. With respect to equitable and achievable, I would argue that those two are linked. If it's not equitable, it won't be achievable. Equitability requires, in the view, I think, of everybody who looks at it seriously, per capita allocation of emission rights. That sort of scheme can work without loss of incentives to improve emissions performance everywhere if it's combined with emissions intensity-based national targets. That avoids any appearance of using GDP itself as a lever, but provides the flexibility you need to bend the emission curves away from business as usual as rapidly as you desire. Few curves demonstrating this approach from a paper written a few years ago by the late Stephen Berno and Sivan Kartha, posted on the EcoEquity website, looking at emissions from the north and the south for a 450 part per million CO2 stabilization scenario corresponding to a 2 degrees C delta T limit if the climate sensitivity is 3 degrees. The per capita emissions trajectories for the same case, basically converging on the same value at the end of the century. And interestingly, they calculated the revenue transfers that would be associated with this under a simplifying assumption about the cost of those permits over time. Concluding observations: what's known and not known about the pace of climate change and the plausible pace and efficacy of mitigation measures is telling us that we need to sharply accelerate mitigation efforts now. Without significant exception, the people who know the most about this problem are the most worried about where we are and where we're headed, and the people who know and think a lot about the interactions of the problem's components, climate system, ecosystem, human system, are the most worried of all. The idea that it will be too costly to undertake the needed measures, I think, is dangerous nonsense. Number one, there are many win-win measures that will make money while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Listen to Amory Lovins tomorrow. Or measures that will bring ancillary benefits that are worth more than the measures cost. Current global expenditures on energy research, development, and demonstration are only 15 to 20 billion a year. That's about 0.5% of total expenditures on energy, 0.03% of world GDP. We could quadruple that amount and probably should without difficulty. Even the most pessimistic assessments of the impact on world GDP of imposing even quite costly greenhouse gas abatement measures end up projecting GDP losses of 3 or 5% in 2050 or 2100. I like to say that given the usual assumption about economic growth, that means people will have to wait until 21 or 2052 to be as rich as they expected to be by 2050. And finally, whatever you think mitigation might cost, the cost of not doing it is going to be more. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to basically go through the remaining presentations, Professor Zhang, Professor Pan, and Dr. Baer in that order. Zhang Haibin is Associate Professor in the School of International Studies at Peking University. Major areas of research are global environmental politics and international organizations. Many wonderful things about his background are said in the material. In order to save time, I will not read it all to you. I will simply turn it over to Professor Zhang, who's going to talk about China's foreign policy toward climate change, continuity and change, and their implications. Professor Zhang.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a great honor for me to speak here. I got a very deep impression from today's discussion. That is, there are two words which are used most frequently. They are climate change and uncertainty. It's true, some uncertainties exist in climate change issue. But one thing is certain. It's totally impossible to address global climate change without cooperation from and between the U.S. and China, the biggest emitter and the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gas. Out of the recognition that the better understanding of China's foreign policy toward climate change will surely facilitate the deeper cooperation between the U.S. and China. I'm going to talk about China's international climate change policy, continuity and change, and the implications for China-U.S. climate change cooperation. Actually, my presentation aims to answer three questions. First, how did China's international climate change policy evolve since 1990s? What's interesting is many observers at home and abroad characterize China's international climate change policy as rejection or a refusal of accepting binding targets for greenhouse gases emissions. Actually, some silent and delicate changes have taken place in the past decade. Second, I want to list factors shaping China's foreign policy toward climate change. Third, as far as China-U.S. cooperation is concerned, how to make China approach global climate change in a more cooperative way. In that sense, because we come here to talk about China-U.S. climate change cooperation, as far as this point is concerned, I like to make some suggestions how to conduct a more fruitful cooperation between these two countries. First, let us look at the main pictures of China's foreign policy toward climate change. In 1991, when China first participated in international negotiations on climate change, China's foreign policy is as follows. First point is China will actively participate in global climate change negotiation. Second, developed countries should take the lead in taking on binding target for greenhouse gas emission cut. Third, developing countries should not be required to set binding target for cutting greenhouse gases emissions. Fourth, given the fact that developed countries make the biggest contributions to global climate change and enjoy strong economic power and advanced technology, they should be primarily responsible for prevention of climate change and provide necessary financial and technical support and assistance to developing countries. The last one is setting binding target for greenhouse gases emission cut should be based on per capita greenhouse gases emissions. That's the main position of Chinese government in 1991 when China first participated in international negotiation on this issue. Then, in 1999, when China participated in international negotiation on this issue, China's policy in this area is as follows. First point, China will not accept binding reduction of greenhouse gases emissions before China becomes a middle-class advanced country. Second, China will spare no efforts to reduce the growth rate of greenhouse gases emission based on sustainable development strategy. Third, China will continue to actively participate in international cooperation in this field of climate change. Fourth, developed countries should provide financial assistance and technology transfer to developing countries. The last, flexibility mechanism should be properly applied. This is what happened in 1999 when China participated in international negotiation. Now let's look at 2005. China's position at COP 10 and 11. The first is UN Framework Convention, UNFCCC, provides a fundamental and effective framework for international cooperation in response to climate change. Compliance with the principles enshrined in convention, particularly the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, is of great significance. Second, countermeasures against climate change should be taken under the framework of sustainable development. Third, great importance should be attached to the role of technology in the combat against climate change. Fourth, mitigation of and adaptation to climate change should be given equal consideration. Last, international community should focus on taking concrete actions against climate change. Win-win international cooperation in this regard, like CDM, should be encouraged. China's position also is reflected in China's position paper on UN reform. I mean, they are quite similar as China's official position at COP 10 and COP 11. Okay, let me look at the observation. What's the continuity? The continuity is China still stick to the principle that opposes setting binding targets for developing countries' greenhouse gas emission cut. What are the changes? There are some changes. That is, China is becoming more cooperative and more flexible. First, China is shifting from deep doubt of flexibility mechanism, particularly CDM, to strong support of it. Second, China is shifting from focusing on financial assistance from developed countries to calling for technical cooperation. Third, China is shifting from concentrating on UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol to support of explorations of other pragmatic and flexible mechanisms. Next, I'd like to explain or list several key factors shaping China's policy. First, I'd like to say abatement cost is one of the most important variables. The more costly to reducing greenhouse gases emissions, the smaller incentives will China have to accept a binding target for greenhouse gases emissions cut. Abatement cost. By abatement cost, I mean tangible interests and intangible interests. Abating or mitigation of climate change may mean possible loss of tangible economic interests and intangible interests. In terms of economic interests, we haven't much study on that. According to Americans' projections, there are many projections on possible economic cost in terms of mitigation of climate change. One estimate is it will cost $4 billion and cause a loss of 5 million jobs. This is one estimate. There are a lot of other estimates. And for Chinese leadership, even like United States, which is most advanced country in the world, they will suffer a lot from the mitigation of climate change, not to mention of China, the developing country. That's one aspect. The other aspect is in terms of intangible interests. From the year 2000 to 2020, for Chinese leadership, this is what we call a strategic opportunity period, which we must take advantage. That's very, very critical and important for China's development, because in the contemporary history, China missed several historical opportunities to develop itself. So this time is a golden opportunity for China. Therefore, development is considered as a first priority. If we take a lot of actions against climate change, that means that will restrict the room for development in the future. Second, ecological vulnerability. The more vulnerable to climate change, the greater incentives will China have to accept binding greenhouse gas emission cut. It's true that in past decade, Chinese government is paying increasing attention to climate change. But frankly speaking, in China's leaders' agenda, climate change is not the most pressing issue. Water shortage and soil erosion, desertification are more present than climate change. Therefore, China is paying more attention, but is not most concerned about that. Third, in terms of responsibility, the more equitable the burden sharing, the more likely for China to take on the binding targets. For China, the most important principle in international environmental cooperation is common but differentiated responsibility. By common, it means every country in the world has the responsibility to take measures against global environmental problems, and, including climate change. But developed countries should take the lead. These are the information from World Resources Institute. From this figure, we can say that developed countries has contributed more than 60% of the total emission of greenhouse gases. And from this figure, we can see that in the past 100 years, China accounts for 7% of the total emission of the world. And US is 30%. For the third part, I'd like to talk a little bit about implications for China-U.S. climate change cooperation. The U.S. can influence and push China international climate change policy by 3 ways. First, by setting an example. If United States join the Kyoto Protocol and take the lead in accepting the binding targets, I think it will greatly encourage China to participate in this process. Second, U.S. can influence China by helping China reduce abatement cost, including various levels of cooperation, technical cooperation, NGOs cooperation, educational cooperation. Many fields, we can do a lot of things in that regard. Third, by promoting China's concern over climate change issue. If Chinese government put climate change higher on the agenda, I think it's more likely for China to take bold action in international negotiations on climate change. Now I'd like to conclude my presentation with a few words. In the 19th century, the UK told the world how to produce. In the 20th century, the US told the world how to consume. In the 21st century, who will tell the world how to achieve sustainable development? Many countries are turning their eyes to China. Can China play such an important role? Frankly speaking, nobody knows. But I do believe if China and the United States can cooperate efficiently and sincerely, China will have more chance to assume such role. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Pan Jiahua. He is the Executive Director of the Research Center for Sustainable Development in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Professor of Economics at that Academy's graduate school, PhD from Cambridge University, works on economic and social dimensions of sustainable development, energy and development, climate policy, economics of the environment and natural resources, has played a major role in Working Group 3 of the IPCC, both in the 3rd assessment report and in the 4th assessment report going on now. Many more fascinating things about him in the bio. Please read it. But for now, please listen. Professor Pan.
Thank you. Well, it's a long day, and I'm tired, and I'm a little bit tired as well. My Chinese is not very Mandarin, and English with Chinese characteristics. Thanks for your tolerance first. Right. Well, regarding energy and emissions demand, we need to, first of all, to have an understanding of the needs. So here I would like to report you on our analysis of some of our findings to share with you some of the numbers here. For tackling climate change problem is one of the pressing issues in the world agenda, and also for individual countries, the priorities can be somewhat different. Many of you, I think that your Chinese are better than mine. Oh my God, I should stop here. From your feeling, you know that China is very much a polluted country. Not only carbon dioxide cannot fill inside China, but sulfur dioxide, acid rains, you can simply tell where you can find the rainfall, and then there is an acid rain. So that's the case in China. And then for, it's not here, the water quality, the major rivers, the quality of the major rivers in China has been downgrading all the time. And among the some 660 cities, with some 1/3 of them without any wastewater treatment facility, without municipal solid waste treatment facility. So some more immediate and difficult environmental challenges are there. And also, yeah, some of the numbers for China are really alarming, like steel production. In year 2000, the total production of steel in China was 190 million tons, and in year 2005, it's 350 million tons already. And also, very energy intensive, because China produces a lot of iron from iron ore, because you have to process the iron ore to produce iron, and then to steel. So that's requires a lot of energy. And then, but anyway, if you look at the other parts of the world, because North America, the European countries, all the other parts of the world are on the decrease in terms of steel production, because this is a stage of development, and at this stage, China does require enormous amount of such raw materials for its physical infrastructure. Okay, I think that the American system does not recognize some of the Chinese sorts of symbols here. The question here, whether the trend would continue, would sustain. Well, because I'm not that pessimistic, because the answer is no. Because, like a human being, when you from a little baby to maturehood, and then everything is there already. So you do not have to grow indefinitely. I'm 170 centimeters. I want to grow bigger, but that's it. No hope to grow bigger, like the American average. Because earlier some speakers examined the Chinese energy consumption versus growth of the economy. If you look, the Chinese economy before 1990, in the middle of 1990s, a lot of fluctuations because the institutional, infrastructure, many problems. And then, only after, entering of the 21st century, and then the growth has been somewhat more stabilized, and then the energy demand has been somewhat more, growing constantly. Okay, we forget this one. Right, this is a picture from the UK experience. Look, because for the UK, because UK has been in the stage of deindustrialization, there isn't much demand for manufacturing inside the UK. There isn't much, need for infrastructure, physical infrastructure construction. So the energy, and the CO2 emissions being projected to decline continuously. So this trend, I think that after China, for another 10 to 20 years, certainly, energy demand and emissions will stabilize and decline. So. From a more historical perspective, China is at such a stage, for urbanization and industrialization. And also for industrialization, there are several stages. And for labor-intensive industrialization, you just add the labor, and then energy requirement is something minimal. And then if you are in the stage of very capital and energy-intensive industrialization, it's necessary that a lot of energy has to be required. And for instance, in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was no highway, and now each year you have some thousands of kilometers of highway are constructed. So that's why you need to have so huge amount of steel and cement, this sort of energy-intensive materials. I think that most of the OECD countries are in the stage of deindustrialization, and China is still in the stage of capital-intensive industrialization. That's why at this stage the numbers seem to be alarming, but it's only transitional. Don't worry that much. And also, if you look at the structure of the economy, China, the structure, the industrial sector, consists of over 50% of share of the economy, something 55 or 56. Because this is, it's in the transition. I think that in the future the service sector will expand, and the service sector is certainly very less energy intensive. Right, that's down to business, the basic needs. The basic needs, the concept is very, very easy. When things are enough, that's enough. When you are full, there's no need to eat more, and eat more, that would be a burden. I think that I'm a bit, overweighted already. So the methodology is very, very simple, because this is from the ultimate demand for the individual consumers. Is very much a bottom-up approach for the calculation of demand for energy for products, and we did have some sort of reference numbers. These are numbers simply, for reference, not for the ultimate, objective. U.S. dollars themselves are not consumable. All we need is the consumable goods for a decent living standard. For the calculation steps, if you, I think that I saw a contract to give up my rights so that everybody can have access to this presentation. It's plenty of time, it's okay. So if you would have any interest, you just have a look, and a paper has been finalized. Probably you may go to our webpage, and we're going to have this published as well. Some more technical, from it's very simple, because for basic necessities, you need food, you need clothes, you need shelter, and you need the infrastructure and services, the transport, and also public and commercial services. All this you can make some calculation, and for our calculation, food is taken at some 2,900 calories per person per day. That's something we've been at that level already, but the others are much lower. And then you may have a question: how for clothes, for food, how can you link this sort of demands to energy? And then we have a distinction between direct and indirect demand for energy, like electricity. This is very much a demand, direct demand of energy. And then for for the chairs, for the building, this is something very much direct. Indirect is a stock. Once you have such a building built ready here, you do not have it built every day. But for for electricity, you have to use it every day. So we have a flow and a stock. The stock, once it is there, what you need is maintenance and replacement. But for flow, like every day you have to cook your meal. Every day you have to probably some may not to watch television, but most people do. If you watch television and then you have to use electricity, this sort of constant everyday daily life, and the measurement is not of energy. It's not in terms of monetary calculation, because in the United States and in Japan, when people make analysis of life cycle, normally the analysis is in terms of monetary calculation. We found that this is something difficult and not that relevant for comparison. For instance, here in the United States, one could, if you take a taxi, probably here you make some $20 US for a 5 kilometers ride, but inside China it might be only $5 US. The consume of oil is something exactly the same. So in monetary terms do not seem to be comparable. And here we use the life cycle analysis based on the European data in physical terms. Here is a very much detailed example of the life cycle of a refrigerator in terms of energy requirement. You can see, from steel, aluminum, all these sorts of materials, and also transport. You have to transport from its factory to the storehouse to the household. So, and also the direct use of the refrigerator. Every day you have to use electricity to keep it in operation. So with all these ideas and these numbers, and we made a preliminary analysis, taking China as a case. And the problem here, we made some assumptions. One is that population. I think that we should not encourage population growth, because demand is by population, and we have fewer people. Of course, when people are on Earth, they have equal right, but this does not mean that you should encourage to have more people. So the total amount of population in China is something 1.3 billion, and also the rate of urbanization, the share of the service sector, and also the rate of employment. We have made some assumptions, some parameters for the analysis, and also here the results is something 2.5 billion tons of oil equivalent, something twice as the current rate of energy consumption in China. Even this is something 1.2 tons of oil equivalent is something half of the EU 25 level, and only some 60% of the world average, the current rate. So then we have a look, what are these items for energy consumption. On the which is left and right, but anyway, that side, right? Okay, this side, this is for total, and this side is for in per capita terms. The direct consumption is something 40% of the total energy, and the indirect one, like food, clothing, housing, furniture, transport, all this, that would require some nearly 60%. So we have all the details of calculation. So the conclusions is our understanding is that once you pass certain stage of development, and then inevitably you have to to follow the rule. Once you have passed the, capital-intensive industrialization, you have to go to the stage of deindustrialization. And the high growth of energy consumption, would be required at a certain stage for the basic need satisfaction, and also life cycle analysis can provide valid information for basic needs calculation, and then for energy and emission reductions. The number is not presented here, but we do have the numbers because emissions to our understanding is nothing. We do not consume emissions. What we consume is energy. So now we have energy emission. You can forget about it. It's not really a concern. The only concern is energy. Then we are going to continue our work. Because for all this calculation is something manual calculation. It's very labor intensive. We're going to build a computer model to once you have the input, you have the output, and then we are going to make some sensitivity analysis. If you would suggest that the basic needs level is too high, the planet Earth is limited, and then we reduce certain amount. If you see, the Europeans or Americans, their size are bigger than the Asians, right, 20% higher, then we can see how much the number would be. And then we are going to expand the analysis to have a look at the other countries as well, India and the United States. If somebody here would be interested, we would like to work together with you to see what, what's the basic necessity level for energy consumption for an average American. And then we're going to make some policy experiment, like the technological progress, energy mix, also consumer behavior. I think that SUVs are very much discouraged now in China because of oil price increases and also a tax by the government. So there are many positive options and win-win solutions. So I think that the world is not that grim at all. It's very much bright for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pan. Our last speaker in this session is Dr. Paul Baer. He completed his PhD in the Energy and Resources Group here at UC Berkeley, looking at climate change policy with a focus on equity and uncertainty. He's currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Environmental Science and Policy at Stanford. He is also a co-founder of the group EcoEquity, which advocates the principle of equal rights to global common resources. Paul?
Thank you very much, John. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be here with such a distinguished group of co-panelists and conference attendees. I'd really like to thank and commend the conference organizers. Those of you who were here this morning may have remembered that Inez Feng pointed out that at the end of the day, the room is filled with close to 1,000 parts per million of CO2, and that makes people sleepy. So I'd like everybody to stand up. Don't want anybody falling asleep. Stretch. Take a deep breath and hold it for 50 years. Thank you very much. What I'm going to present to you this afternoon is a framework that we call greenhouse development rights. We, in this context, is EcoEquity, and particularly I'd like to point out my co-director, Tom Athanasiou, who is sitting back there, along with several collaborators who will be shown in our my acknowledgement slides. The equity principle behind greenhouse development rights is the idea that everybody should have an equal right to the benefits of the global commons for human development and welfare. And what I'm going to try to argue is that this is actually a stronger equity principle than the principle of equal per capita emissions rights. The problem we're all trying to solve, and I think John Holdren and others have done a great job of showing this, is to avoid a climate catastrophe. We must find a way to rapidly and sharply reduce CO2 emissions in both developing and industrialized countries. How sharply would be a subject for another talk, although John covered a lot of it. It is one of my major research areas. I actually believe that we do need stabilization of carbon dioxide below today's levels, not 550 parts per million, not 450 parts per million, but probably closer to 350 or 370. That allows a little bit of room for non-CO2 gases and to still have a high probability of staying below the 2 degrees C threshold. Yet, as we know, it's simply not ethical or realistic to expect poor countries to pay significantly for greenhouse gas reductions. Everybody knows this. Therefore, if we're going to solve the problem, the world's rich countries should, and I argue will because I'm an optimist, pay essentially all the incremental costs of mitigation globally. And we can afford it. This has been demonstrated by a variety of panelists, and we've spoken about further tomorrow in the technology panel. But again, even if it's a matter of a few tens of billions or a few hundreds of billions of dollars per year, it's not going to break the bank. It might make us a little bit poorer and a little bit slower, or richer a little bit more slowly. But to do this will require a new commitment to human development as the basis of a new global climate regime. That is to say, the climate regime will have to become a sustainable development regime, and it will have to be integrated with other global regimes, such as the trade and finance regimes. Here's a graph that demonstrates the scale of the problem. The top line is an emissions scenario that is consistent. What is the problem? Anyway, the top line is an emissions scenario that's consistent with stabilization at 400 parts per million CO2 equivalent. There are, of course, many possible such lines depending on your view of uncertainties. What I have shown here is emissions for the southern countries, basically non-Annex 1 countries under the UNFCCC, growing at a rate of 1.5% per year, and emissions for the northern countries, basically whatever is left between the stabilization trajectory and growing emissions in the south. What this shows is that even if emissions in the north went to zero, by about 2030 there would simply be no room left for emissions growth in the developing world. At this point, given plausible assumptions about economic growth and population growth, per capita emissions in the south would only be about 1 or 1.2 tons of carbon per person per year, well below the current industrialized country average. And income, per capita income in the developing countries would only be on the order of $5,000, $6,000, $8,000, $10,000 per year, again, depending on your assumptions about economic growth. So those countries will still be poor compared to the countries today that seem to be so unwilling to actually spend money on mitigation. And this could vary a little bit. If this curve went a little bit differently or the growth rate was a little bit slower, this point of intersection could be a little bit further out, but not much. Simply put, the developing countries cannot do the same thing that the rich countries did, not if we are to avoid a global climate catastrophe. So to try to resolve these problems and these contradictions, the Greenhouse Development Rights Framework has the following properties. First, it's a global policy framework based on an explicit emissions trajectory that is consistent with a precautionary temperature target. Of course, these would have to be negotiated, but it's going to look something like the one that I showed you. Secondly, the obligations for all countries, developed and developing, are calculated on the basis of an index of responsibility and capacity applied to income groups within countries. The importance of this is that if you assume that the capacity index has something to do with, for example, by how much you exceed some threshold, a country as a whole could be well below that threshold in its per capita income, but there will be at least some fraction of the population of that country that is higher than that income threshold and that has actual capacity and presumably responsibility. Finally, countries are divided by a development threshold. Those below the threshold discharge their obligations by incremental investment in human development. This is a requirement on developing countries. Countries above the threshold discharge their obligations as a proportionate share of the global mitigation burden. Just to illustrate it simply, this is business as usual, as it were, or something like it. So we sometimes talk about no regrets baselines. This is where you have to be. This gap is the gap that has to be made up, and you're dividing it proportional to the responsibility capacity index for the wealthy countries. Key features of the Greenhouse Development Rights Framework: it meaningfully guarantees that the South's right to development is not compromised by mitigation costs. And we believe that it does this in a way that even per capita allocation cannot do. That was the point of the graph that I showed you earlier. Secondly, it combines responsibility and capacity into a single explicit calculation of obligation. There are a number of other proposals for global frameworks that are floating around. Some of you may have seen the South-North Dialogue in the Greenhouse, or the Climate Action Network's framework proposal, which allude to the importance of responsibility and capacity, but there's no explicit calculation of an index or discussion of how it will be assigned. In my original version of this slide, I actually had key innovations, but then I remembered having seen something a few years before, and in fact, Peter pointed it out. He and Kirk Smith and their collaborators had done exactly this more than 10 years ago, and it is both interesting and sad that we are now reinventing the wheel. Finally, and this I believe is in fact the most important part of the GDR's framework, it acknowledges inequality within nations by requiring rich people in poor countries to invest explicitly and to increase that investment in human development rather than mitigation. Poor countries all say that we have to prioritize poverty alleviation and economic development. That's why we can't afford mitigation. This is basically the deal. We will pay for mitigation. You put your money where your mouth is. This is both essential because increased rates of human development are necessary both for mitigation and adaptation to actually work, and because it is simply politically necessary that rich people in the developing world not be seen or not actually be free riding on the global climate regime. There are several issues of the GDR's framework that are still work in progress, both for research and, of course, they would become subjects for negotiation. First of these, variations of the responsibility and capacity index. There is, needless to say, an infinite possible variety of such indices. Secondly, addressing the problem of calculating national no-regrets baselines. As I said, the obligation in any commitment period that has to be divided is a function of the difference between the baselines and the targets. So you have to have a way of figuring out a reasonable goal for those baselines. And third, exploring the options for how you would actually calculate, measure, and implement these additional obligations for investment in development on the basis of intranational income emissions distribution. Then there are all the usual issues that apply to any plausible global regime. What institutions would be necessary to make the financial transfers work? How would enforcement work? How would you treat emissions from land use? How would you treat non-CO2 gases, et cetera? But I point out that, again, these are everybody's problems. The political challenges, and I'm going to put this particularly in the context of the U.S.-China case, greenhouse development rights, like any fair climate regime, would require the U.S. to pay the largest share of global mitigation and adaptation costs. This is painfully obvious and depressing because Americans have been told they should not expect to have to pay anything to prevent climate change if it's actually happening. And they certainly haven't been told that they're going to have to pay both to reduce emissions around the world and to pay for adaptation around the world. So this is a huge obstacle, but it is essential if the global resources to solve the problem are going to be mitigated. Are going to be met. We have a very, very large political problem in this country. Which reminds me, by the way, a point I keep wanting to stress. There's a great deal of discussion about the balance between the U.S. and China and the symmetry here, and this is just so wrong. The U.S. is a huge free rider on the global commons. China has in fact done anything and everything that could reasonably be asked of it in the time up till now. That's not true of what's going forward in the future. There's a lot of possibilities, but this is not a symmetrical case. This is a global criminal and a developing country. Secondly, simply because of China's size, much of this investment, much of the ways and means would have to go to China. Now, Americans have been made very fearful of China's economic competition, that we already have a very large trade deficit. The idea that in addition to that, we are going to have to subsidize both mitigation and adaptation in China is not going to go over well either. But it is inevitable. It is how the problem is structured. But China and other developing countries will have to transparently increase their commitment to poverty alleviation and sustainable economic development. This is, to say the least, what is considered an infringement on their sovereignty, and it's not going to go over well, but it is the necessary part of the deal from southern countries. Some closing thoughts. First, this is not a proposal to solve the climate problem through bilateral U.S.-China negotiations. It is simply not acceptable for China and the U.S. to decide how much between the two of them they're willing to spend to solve the problem and to let that be how much climate change there will be. Quite the contrary, this is a call for a global political agreement, a grand compromise that has at least a chance of supporting an effort on the necessary scale. It's easy to dismiss greenhouse development rights as unrealistic. However, classical realism, which holds that nations only act in their short-term self-interest, is demonstrably part of the problem. And for those of you who have read any of the economics or game theoretical literature about international negotiations, they quite literally conclude, first, it's essentially impossible to solve the problem. And secondly, to the extent that you want to have a global cooperative solution, the countries that will suffer the most from climate change should pay the countries that cause it. That's simply not going to happen. We prefer to think that realism means asking, what will it really take to solve this problem, and then devising a political strategy that has a hope of achieving it. And that's what we're trying to do. Finally, and this is my last point, something like this will be necessary if we're to avoid a climate catastrophe. It almost certainly will not be called greenhouse development rights. Who knows what it will be called? But it's going to have some of these properties. The rich will have to pay, and it will have to make human development, sustainable economic development, the centerpiece of the climate regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. I wonder if now for the panel discussion and audience question and answer, I could invite Professor C.S. Kiang and Dr. Peter Hayes to come up and join the panel. Dr. Kiang in the room? Perhaps not. Ah, yes, there it is. And let me begin by asking, before we go to the audience, whether in response to this barrage of analysis, suggestions, proposals, and so on, whether either Dr. Hayes or Professor Kiang have any observations or questions that they would want to launch the larger discussion with. Cries of outrage are also acceptable.
I'd like to ask how did China define becoming a middle-class country, at which point it would accept binding reduction of greenhouse gases? What was the actual definition of middle class?
For China, middle-class advanced countries like Spain, Portugal, in today's EU, that's what we mean middle-class advanced country.
Right.
Portugal, Spain.
So that would then imply a graduation into a different category?
In terms of the GDP, in terms
Right.
of GDP.
No, I mean, in the Framework Convention, there is a problem there with different categories.
Yeah. So
we would have to have an amendment to the Framework Convention to allow graduation as countries increase their economic level.
China's basic position is that if China reach level of Spain and Portugal today in terms of per capita GDP, China, of course, sooner or later will join the countries of Annex 1 to take on the binding target.
Okay, Professor Kiang, did you want to?
I think I would like to make some comment, and I think the most important thing about this conference or this forum is try to understand each side, their position, and also what are the availability of the possible solution, like a technical, how to cut emission. I think those are very informative. I think like this panel actually already provide option. And I think both Professor Pan and also Professor Zhang and try to outline where the China they are and what is their priority and how they're going to come to the negotiation table. But also, I think Paul is the one give us some very idealistic but very starting point. And how politically realistic, I think it's going to take some long time to make it happen. But at least, I think that's a very good beginning. which means you respect about each other and identify the common denominator and respect the difference. I think this is the beginning of the negotiation. I think that's very healthy. But I would like to just ask about, do you have any idea? And once we understand that, I still think it doesn't matter. You're going to mitigation, and there are technology available. There are possible technology transfer. And there are possible win-win situations, because sometimes a more efficient technology, actually you can have an economic gain. California already demonstrates something of that. So it's not necessary, and China say, hey, if we want to reduce the emission, that means high cost. That's not necessarily true. Those kind of know-how, I think, need be start to communicate, and some of the more detailed formula can be step by step and generated. And I don't believe that you can accomplish it in one meeting. I just want to make this comment. And I do hope this conference and this forum can find some way. It's not like either 100% you have to go this way or other 100% go that way. And you must find something, solution between somebody say China and United States are the biggest emissions, so they both need to cut. Or you say, based on the history and what you should cut or you shouldn't cut. I really believe some detailed mechanism and need to be developed. And I really believe there are room, or I believe there are plenty of room. So I think I'm quite optimistic about that. And the reason, because we have to believe, and the more efficient technology, and sometimes can generate a new economic. But in the meantime, the old way of the industry and process, I think maybe need to change. It does not matter in China or United States. I think the whole world. I just want to make some comment. I just feel there's a hopeful thing. I hope we can more focus and try to find out and provide some solution.
Thank you. I think at this point we will open it up to the audience and take questions and comments. Yes, first one I've seen is there in the back.
In part, that's impossible to disagree with. There are several questions that would have to be resolved, of course. One is, what is the life cycle cost of carbon emissions? What is the social cost of carbon? How are you going to decide what it is? How are you going to value human lives in other countries? How are you going to estimate the discount rate? Because that's what's required to do full life cycle costing. The broader part of the question is, can you make doing what you ought to do to prevent climate change profitable? I believe the answer is, in many cases, yes, you can. But I also believe that if you don't point out the fact that you have to do it, even when it stops being profitable, that you are not actually going to solve the problem.
Okay, next question, sir. Yeah.
It appears that you can shift the carbon emissions in the smelting and the cement producing industries depending on market demand. For example, if I paid the same amount for electricity that the aluminum producers pay, I could burn up everything and still have a great amount of money to spend for other things. In other words, they get the 3 cents per kilowatt hour very cheap compared to the market price. And so if you shift this to other countries, China is making steel production. The big demand and the big loss in the early years was when they stopped the everybody has a smelter concept and made it more efficient.
Any comment on that? Professor Pan?
Yes, definitely you are right. There are many opportunities, simple application of technologies and also the use of market instruments That is why, we have so many options. So now we take actions, and then there must be solutions.
Okay, now there was another one. Yes, right there.
We heard some brilliant ideas here today, and King and act immediately. Since I'm not, this is really a question for the Westerners on the panel. How can we bring the obviously recalcitrant American public around to seeing the pressing need for acting within a few decades in a dramatic way, when they're already on record as opposing any kind of gas tax, carbon tax, vehicle?
Let me tackle that one. Well, the question is, how can you get the American political leadership to recognize the need for early action, and the public? And let me comment on that. I actually think the public, and indeed much of the industry, is ahead of the political leaders on this. The recent polling results that I've seen indicate that the fraction of the American public who say that global climate change is not a problem is down to 7%. 93% of Americans in the latest polling results indicate that climate change is a problem. They differ on how urgent it is and how much action has to be taken soon. But the fact that we're over 90% recognition that this is a real problem is an extraordinary foundation for action in a country where 90% agree on hardly anything. Second point, there really has been a sea change in American industry, with large numbers of the biggest and most successful companies in the United States not only taking their own actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and making a lot of money at it, but testifying in congressional hearings that the country needs an economy-wide mandatory approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It really is quite extraordinary. I believe, therefore, that it's only a matter of either waiting till the composition of the Congress changes later this year, or waiting until the composition of the White House changes in 2008 if impeachment doesn't get it done sooner, before we will have a real prospect of serious climate change policies in the United States. I'm an optimist.
John, can I
Peter?
add a comment? Another stratagem is to let what passes for an international policy on this topic, the so-called Asia-Pacific Clean Technology Partnership, which was announced, I can't remember how many months ago, not very long ago, which is led by the United States and Australia, and includes, I think now, Japan, Korea, China, and India, which is basically to rely on market mechanisms to achieve technology transfer with minimal funding from those wealthy countries. Let's try that again. There's nothing wrong with trying that again. And in fact, China, I believe, said, let's try it again at the inaugural meeting in Sydney, but also said at the same time, very loudly and clearly, as did Japan, that what is really critical is to try it again as we reconstruct, as we move to the post-Kyoto framework, and ultimately creating a global framework that starts to move us in the right direction on both mitigation and adaptation will achieve its effects through political mechanisms in the United States. There are many of them. And then the other important leverage is at the mayoral level. I think it was earlier this year that some 500 mayors in the United States of cities signed on to fairly stringent greenhouse gas reduction targets for their cities. This leaves, I'm not sure how many major cities are not party to that commitment. So to some extent, the United States can exercise its sort of foreign policy on these matters from the local level and just ignore what's going on in Washington.
Yeah, please.
I want to make a comment on that. I think about technology transfer issue. You know, you mentioned about the the Asian clean technology. I think it has been discussed about they call offset technology, which means more efficient technology, and which you can reduce the pollution and then improve the efficiency. I think the issue, there's some of the issue we need to take much more serious issue behind that is you can have technology transfer, but in the meantime, the intellectual property issue. I think both India and China, and which two other countries, now they have a low labor cost. You know, everything is already make the job availability in the North American or maybe Europe, and all very sensitive about this the issue of the future. If they can say you can give the technology transfer, but in the meantime, if you don't respect the intellectual property, it may be not a good deal. I just want to caution there's some other issue in which are behind the technology transfer, which I think it could be win-win situation if the technology, the intellectual property issue can be better handled by the country involved.
Paul, you wanted to add something?
Just briefly. I believe it's important to recognize that for all our beliefs about it, this country is not actually a democracy. It's an elite-led country, and it's particularly led by the business class. However, most of the business class is extremely well educated, and just because you're conservative doesn't mean you have to be stupid. And I think we are now in a situation where those of us who have any kinds of social connections with people who are running banks or other large companies or anything, this is what I call now, this represents somewhat of my bias as an elite school graduate, your take your college roommate to lunch theory of preventing climate change. We need to get people who ought to know that this is a serious problem and they don't want to be the ones responsible for saying to their grandchildren, yeah, we had a chance and we blew it because, we were cheap.
Yes, in the back there. Would any of our Chinese colleagues like to take a shot at that? The question was, we've heard a little bit about public views of climate change in the United States, and the question is to our Chinese colleagues, what is the public profile of the climate change issue in China?
Right. Since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, quite a few capacity building projects have been implemented. And one of the elements is awareness raising. There have been many TV programs, TV shows, newspaper articles, and I think that we do have a gentleman from the State Environmental Protection Administration who has made quite a few surveys. He must have the number. What's the number? You have any idea?
So in China, we have some environmental education program on the climate change, work together with the Canada government. So tomorrow I will show you some of the example and try to answer your question. Okay?
So it's still secret.
Good. Everybody come back tomorrow. Yes, in the back, middle. I guess there were two parts to that question. I'm not sure I understood the second. The first part had to do with the status of investments in alternative fuels in China. And I think the second part was that if China becomes the world leader in investment in alternative fuels, what impact would that have on incentives elsewhere? Was that the...
Right. I think that the definition of alternative fuels or alternative energy may vary, and you may include nuclear, you may include large hydro, and for these two areas, I think that a huge amount of investment has been made in nuclear power development and large hydro, like the Three Gorges along with 18.3 gigawatts of generating capacity, some 200 billion RMB yuan. That's a lot of investment. This for large hydro and nuclear. Very aggressive policy to add the capacity for power generation, and the more new and renewable energy resources. I think we would include wind, small hydro, biomass, bioenergy. In all this, and I think that the Chinese government has been pretty ambitious as well. According to the long-term plan, by 2020, some 15% of its energy in total will be from these new and renewable energy sources, like windmills, everywhere, from the north, even in the south. There are many windmills simultaneously under construction, and also quite a few huge biofuels, like biodiesel, ethanol plants are in operation already. And also in addition, because of the lack of oil, there are two huge conversion plants to simply the conversion of coal to oil, each with a capacity of 5 million tons of oil each year. So two together, that would be something 10 million tons of oil if these two plants are completed. So there are, and I think that the solar energy is also, and here I do not see many, solar panel for water heating on rooftop of the houses. But if you go to China, everywhere in the cities, in the rural areas, the solar panels for water heating, that's everywhere, and solar PV, that's part of the government policy for poverty alleviation and also to electrify the remote areas. So this has also been aggressively pursued as well. And because of the scale of the production has been so huge, probably China may be able to accumulate some sort of technology, and then possibly, for instance, solar water heating system is more advanced than the European ones, because it's simply because in terms of cost and conversion of energy, it's more effective, and it's highly advanced already, and it's been exported, I heard, to European and the African continent as well. So I think that there is a potential for China in this area, some sort of possible leadership.
Make a very brief comment. If only 15% of China's fuel comes from renewable sources in 2020, we're going to have a very, very, very big problem. It's a very reasonable goal for China. It is not a reasonable goal for the rest of the world. That returns me to my point. We are going to have to be the ones to pay to increase that fraction, and I hate to say this, to bury the rest of the carbon coming from those coal plants in the ground.
Okay, let's see. I've been missing this side. Let me get the back there, yes.
The problems we are discussing here were being brought to my attention already in the 70s and 60s by eminent scientists who were then shut down as doomsday prophets. They approached me as a young person to develop design concepts. I'm a conceptual designer. I'm applying to my own life, aimed at an idea of aiming for a than aiming at high standard of living. So in that way, I have been able to live in a low lifestyle, live a healthy body and a happy mind, use no refrigerator, use just a few hundred kilowatts of electricity per month, and actually can live without running water. Now, what I would propose is that perhaps we could start a global education system of our education program on how people could feel fulfillment in life to aim at the lowest possible standard of living and be happy with it. Is there any possibility in the direction for us to solve our problem? Because the scenario that has been unfolded by these groups, they probably 30 years ago, I've seen it unfolding, and we are still discussing if it is really true.
Let me offer a brief comment on that, and then some of my fellow panelists may want to disagree with me. I've been observing and interested in these kinds of ideas for many years, and it's my impression that these ideas of living more simply and with a smaller impact on resources and being satisfied with a level of material existence which is less than that to which many currently aspire, is a set of ideas that can attract perhaps 5 or 10% of the population. But it seems to be extremely difficult to get those ideas to spread beyond that modest proportion of people who are attracted to them. And that being so, and I having seen it to be so for such a long time, I'm reluctant to believe I'm wrong about it. That being so, we can be grateful for that 5 or 10%, but I think we have to continue to seek ways to get the other 90 or 95% on trajectories that are consistent with sustainable well-being on the planet.
Can I?
Yeah. You want to comment on that? Yeah.
Right. Certainly, I think that the consumer behavior is definitely the key, the answer. And I think that the direction of consumption pattern is not right. Here in the United States, quite a few rich people have their own private aircrafts. And in China, quite a few rich are trying to have their own as well. This is not the right direction. And that's why we propose the basic needs approach. Enough is enough. If something is luxury, okay, that is okay. That's not a crime. But the Earth is a planet, and then we have to use some sort of economic instruments. If you consume more than the necessity amount, you have to pay more. Like the progressive income tax, you have to pay some 10 or even 20 times if you consume some, twice as the about the average level. So if we have the institutions and the instruments in position, and it is possible to shape the behavior of the general public.
Any other thoughts, Paul?
I think John is right, particularly when it comes to the extreme cases of voluntary simplicity, but I think also there is a problem that is somewhere in between that we might think about. We've come to believe that, in fact, there are essentially unlimited resources on this planet, and therefore, if I can pay for it, I have the right to have it. It's become painfully clear, particularly in the case of climate change, that that's simply not true. We have finally hit limits to growth, and we're just barely beginning to confront it. What we need for people to recognize is, if I am actually using more than a sustainable share, if I'm emitting more than 0.3 of a ton of carbon per year, which is debatably sustainable, I am actually doing something which causes other people to be able to use less. And we need to, at some level, get the idea that over-consuming is, in some sense, a violation of the rights of people in the commons, and that it's sort of like littering, and it's really not a good thing, rather than what we have now, which is the idea, gosh, success is earning more money, so I can buy as much as I want and consume as much as I want.
Peter?
I actually have a question for John that follows on from that last question, which is, if the dangerous anthropogenic kinds of extremes in climate change impacts turn out to be upon us in short order, much sooner than was thought about in the last decade. For example, if sea level rises faster, or no, probably movement of rainfall patterns, flooding, wetlands, migratory bird patterns, avian flu. Some shift that is attributable to climate change that results in a truly catastrophic outcome. And we shift into what has been in the past a wartime footing in terms of the level of commitment, both domestically in the United States and in terms of the kinds of international cooperation that occurred after World War II. How fast could you move towards some of the more dramatic or radical control scenarios?
Well, I think very rapidly indeed. I mean, as has already been mentioned by many speakers, there is a tremendous array of measures that exist that could be embraced and very rapidly expanded on the sort of footing that you describe. And I think that this is a fairly likely outcome. That is, that we are going to see an array of climate change consequences that come to persuade a substantial fraction of the people on the planet that we have a crisis and that we have to take appropriate measures. And then you will see both efficiency and a wide variety of kinds of renewables ramped up very rapidly. I think you'll see carbon capture and sequestration on remaining fossil fuel technologies ramped up very rapidly, and I think we'll discover that that is a whole lot more affordable than living with the consequences of not doing it. We are at the end of our allotted time. I think we really, with apologies to the people whose hands are still up, need to call it to an end. And I believe I'm being invited to turn it over to Jim Williams to announce what's going to happen next.
First, I'd like to thank this very, very stimulating panel. John Holdren, Han Jiahua, Zhang Haibin, Paul Baer, Zhang Jiasu, and Peter Hayes. And I'd like to thank all of the panelists who have been with us today and made this such a remarkable day. We've come to an end of day one of the China-U.S. Climate Change Forum. We'll be starting our second and final day tomorrow at 8:30 sharp. And I want to encourage all of you to come back tonight for the showing of the sneak preview of the Al Gore feature film, 8 o'clock here in Wheeler Auditorium. I want to mention that there have been a number of requests from audience members for copies of slides that were shown here today. I want to mention a couple of things. One is that this event will be webcast, and you should keep your eye on the China-U.S.climate.org website for further information about links to that. And I also will temporarily put the speakers on the spot by saying that we will have program assistants come around and ask which speakers give their permission to have these slides posted, and those that do, those slides will be made downloadable from the Climate Change Forum website. So with that, I want to thank you all very much. It's been a long, stimulating day. Give yourself a good round of applause.